order the second meeting of the 38th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. I now invite the Commission to continue its general discussion of Agenda Item 6, Preparations for the World Conference on Women, Action for Equality, Development and Peace. Before giving the floor to the first speaker on my list, I would like to remind delegations that the deadline for inscription on the list of speakers under Item 6 is today at 6:00 p.m. I now give the floor to the representative of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I should like to speak about the activities which are being carried out by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in accordance with its mandate, and that in regard to preparations for the World Conference of Beijing in 1995. The activities of the region culminate in this first stage with the Sixth International Conference on the Integration of Women in Economic and Social Development of Latin America and the Caribbean in Mar del Plata, Argentina, on the 26th to 30th of September 1994. Up to present, the principal meetings relative to this conference have consisted in regular meetings of the Steering Committee of the Regional Conference, meeting twice a year to prepare the position of the region for the conference, and in interinstitutional meetings, the last of which took place in December of last year. The next meetings in the region before the September conference will be two meetings of the Steering Committee, one in Curaçao on the 30th, 1st of July, 30th June, 1st of July, and the other just before the conference on the 24th of September in Mar del Plata, Argentina. In addition, sub-regional meetings will take place, the first of which has already been set for all the countries of the Caribbean on the 27th and 28th of June in Curaçao. With regard to the more substantive preparations and the documentation, we are preparing two sorts of products for this conference. On the one hand, the Regional Action Program, which is being worked on in the Latin American Caribbean region on the mandate by the 5th Regional Conference, Curaçao of 91. This action program is being discussed in an expert group, will be discussed in an expert group with the UN organizations and intergovernmental organizations and the Steering Committee. And the first draft of this action program will be sent to the governments, the member governments of ECLA by mid-April in order to get their reactions before the conference and in order that the regional conference have a full documentation before its September meeting. The document should also be discussed in sub-regional meetings, which we hope will be held latest in July for the Central American region and the Southern Cone, depending upon the extra budgetary finances. The new proposals adopted by the member governments of ECLA for Latin American Caribbean take into account the main changes which have taken place in the 90s throughout the region, and in addition to the themes which are normally dealt with, education, employment, health, political participation on the part of women, which are being developed together with the specialized agencies. We have placed special emphasis on a heading on human female human resources and on the subject of violence against women and the incorporation of these in the policies of the region. With regard to the reports, or the kind of communications which we have maintained throughout the region, in the first place, we have sent information to the member states, and we have received information from them regarding everything having to do with the composition of the national teams and their reports. Nonetheless, in our region this year, a number of countries have their own processes of elections and so on. So I don't think we should get those national reports in time for consideration within the substantive documents which are presently being drafted. We do hope to prepare an executive program document which will be considered by the conference. With respect to reports to non-governmental organizations, we have received reports, communications from them, and we have informed the representatives of the Forum of NGOs, as well as evaluating and putting together our list of NGOs in our region with a view to their eventual participation in the conference. These processes have been most dynamic. The interest demonstrated by the NGOs in Latin America and the Caribbean is high, and their support for this subject has been very deep, both for the governmental conference as well as the NGO conference. Finally, I should like to inform you that all preparations for toward the conference have been finalized, and the Argentine government has thrown its resolute support behind the conference, which will be both our 6th regular conference and our preparatory regional conference for the Beijing conference. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I now call on the representative of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Madam Chairperson, Madam Secretary General, distinguished delegates. In its resolution 46/6 of 13 June 1990 on the integration of women in all aspects of development, the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific requested the Executive Secretary to convene in 1993 a regional intergovernmental meeting on women in development to review the progress achieved in Asia and the Pacific in implementing the Nairobi forward-looking strategies for the advancement of women. In its resolution 1990/12 of 24th May 1990 on a World Conference on Women to be held in 1995, the Economic and Social Council had recommended that a World Conference on Women be held in 1995. Subsequently, that resolution was endorsed by the General Assembly in its resolution 45/129 of 14 December 1990 on the implementation of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies for the advancement of women. In the light of those resolutions, ESCAP at its 48th session in 1992 endorsed the proposal that a regional ministerial conference on women in development should be convened in 1994. Accordingly, Madam Chairperson, the Second Asian and Pacific Ministerial Conference on Women in Development will be convened in Jakarta from 7 to 14 June 1994. That conference will also serve as a regional preparatory activity for the 4th World Conference on Women. The Commission at its 48th session endorsed the provisional time frame and agenda of the Ministerial Conference. According to the provisional time frame, the Ministerial Conference would comprise 2 sessions: a 5-day meeting of senior officials to review and appraise the implementation of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies in the ESCAP region, followed by a 2-day ministerial conference on the status of women in the ESCAP region. The meeting of senior officials would serve as a preparatory meeting for the ministerial conference. It would be devoted primarily to review and appraise of the regional implementation of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies and the formulation of a plan of action to advance the status of women in Asia and the Pacific in keeping with the aims and objectives of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies. In order to focus attention on the critical regional issues and priorities in line with the global vision reflected in the strategies, the meeting would be divided into 3 working groups to deliberate on the following 3 major areas of concern: women in economic development, women in social development, and women and empowerment. The ministerial conference would follow immediately the preparatory meeting of senior officials. It would provide a venue where ministers responsible for the advancement of women in the ESCAP region could exchange views and reach a consensus on further action in the region to implement the Nairobi forward-looking strategies. In their main policy statements, the ministers would present their views on the implementation of the strategies in the region from the point of view of their national experiences, with special reference to women in economic development, women in social development, and women in empowerment. On the basis of that exchange of views, the ministers would consider for adoption a plan of action for the advancement of women in the ESCAP region in line with the aims and objectives of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies. It is envisaged, Madam Chairperson, that the adoption of the plan of action for the advancement of women in Asia and the Pacific would be the highlight of the ministerial conference. At its 48th session, the Commission recommended that a regional meeting of non-governmental organizations on women in development should be held as a preparatory activity for the Second Asian and Pacific Ministerial Conference on Women in Development, to be held at Jakarta from 7 to 14 June 1994. In pursuance of that recommendation, ESCAP and the National Commission on the Role of Filipino Women convened the Asian and Pacific Symposium of Non-Governmental Organizations on Women in Development at Manila from 16 to 20th November 1993. Madam Chairperson, as you were present at that meeting, you know that this was the first of a kind in the Asia-Pacific region. The symposium was attended by 550 participants from 320 national, regional, and international NGOs working on women's issues. In addition, about 100 observers, including representatives from 7 United Nations agencies, intergovernmental organizations, several donor agencies, and governments attended the symposium. The symposium discussed extensively the situation of women in the region, especially the trends in recent years in the context of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies for the advancement of women. The report of that NGO symposium will be also placed before the ministerial conference. Another preparatory meeting for the Second Asian and Pacific Ministerial Conference on Women in Development convened by ESCAP was the expert group meeting on women in development, which was convened from 8 to 11 February 1994 to review the background documents and a draft plan of action for the advancement of women prepared by the Secretariat, which will be submitted to the ministerial conference. Currently, the Secretariat is revising the documents in the light of the recommendations of the expert group meeting. Madam Chairperson, I would like to end my statement by saying that from the convening of we are only 3 months away from the convening of the Second Asian and Pacific Ministerial Conference on Women in Development. And therefore, we are nearly at the end of our preparations. Substantive preparations, as well as administrative and logistic preparations are smoothly on the way. I am happy to inform you that we are all eager to convene the conference, and I hope that we will have the support of all of you present here at this Commission session. Thank you.
I thank the representative of ESCAP, and now may I call on the representative of Zambia.
Thank you. Madam Chairperson, allow me to begin by congratulating you and the other members of the Bureau on your very well-deserved election. Madam Chairperson, I would also like to thank and congratulate Mrs. Mongela, the Secretary General of the Fourth World Conference for Women, for this first draft of the Platform for Action. My delegation is happy that with this effort in that it is now clear that the platform for action is taking shape and is definitely on its way to becoming a concise and accessible document. The draft does provide an initial and general approach which should assist this session to elaborate the strategic objectives and the action to be taken to achieve them. My delegation is particularly pleased with the inclusion in the draft of the narrative on the global framework. We feel that in order to appreciate the various dimensions of the problems of women, it is important to have an analysis of the global situation. This section on the global framework must be strengthened to reflect the realities of the world situation. Madam Chairperson, my delegation holds the view that at this stage of the preparations for the World Conference, our efforts should now focus on an in-depth analysis of the persistent problems common to women from all parts of the globe. We consider it necessary that we conduct an analysis of each of the critical areas of concern and indeed identify the areas where additional work needs to be done. Questions such as, have women made progress at all? If not, why have we not made the desired progress? We need to proceed to examine concrete measures to overcome the various obstacles to the achievement of the goals and objectives of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies. It is, therefore, gratifying that the program of work for the 30th session of the Commission on the Status of Women takes the view that the work concerning the preparations for the 4th World Conference on Women should have the highest priority during this session. Madam Chairperson, it would not be realistic to expect, nor is it being suggested, that solutions to all problems be found at this forum. But it is important that we demonstrate that we have made a constructive and informed analysis of the problems confronting women and offered various possible solutions. We have to meet this challenge. Madam Chairperson, my delegation holds the view that it is important that the deliberations of this and future sessions reflect the political, economic, and social realities of the world as they exist today. To this effect, I beg your indulgence, Madam Chairperson, in that my delegation feels obliged to discuss the plight of the invisible women of Africa. There can be no denying of the fact that the problems of women are not different from country to country, but that they only differ in intensity. This view that differences in the problem of women are a matter of degree should not be oversimplified. A close examination of the problems of the African women will reveal that a specific examination of the situation in Africa and the least developed countries is called for. The complexity of these problems demand that they be specifically addressed. Indeed, the poor and marginalized women of Africa will expect nothing less than a recognition of their plight and sustained and viable action to overcome the vulnerabilities under which they live. Africa remains the only region in the world where human and social conditions continue to give great cause for concern. More than a decade of economic decline has been accompanied by a significant deterioration, even a reversal of earlier gains in human welfare and well-being. The economic crisis arises fundamentally from the lopsided structure of African economies compounded by varying degrees of policy failures in economic management and institutional weakness. There has been a bias against rural areas in official policy, resulting in the neglect of food production and undermining of the development of rural areas. Several external factors, as dictated by the prevailing international economic order, have, without a doubt, contributed to the region's economic crisis. Africa's export earnings, both in volume and prices, have collapsed, resulting in a balance of payments crisis, which is accompanied by an external debt of a staggering $282.2 billion. The debt service burden drains the region of well over $26.1 billion annually. These resources could otherwise have been invested in development. Statistics also show, Madam Chairperson, that aid to the developing world from the North has been declining by $2 billion per year since 1990, and that the growth of resource flows have been captured by only a few countries which are viewed as potential markets. The poorest countries, which are most in need of help, are in reverse, crippled by debt and unable to attract direct private investment. Given that African economies are much smaller than those of other developing countries, debts on this scale pose proportionately a far greater burden for its people. The response of most African governments to these harsh realities has been to cut back on basic necessities, to pay debt service charges, and to undertake structural adjustment programs aimed at opening up their economies. Drastic reductions in public expenditure have brought unemployment and cut deep into health and education services provision. As a result, today, an overwhelming majority of Africans are caught in a vicious cycle of ignorance, poverty, unemployment and underemployment, malnutrition and hunger, disease and ill health. The end result is that these trends engender the marginalization and exclusion of women, especially the rural women. It is a regrettable fact that given the severe conditions that these women have to live in, they cannot even be expected to begin to seriously talk about inequality between men and women in the sharing of power and decision-making at all levels. It is difficult for women in these conditions to talk of insufficient mechanisms at all levels to promote the advancement of women. These women are actually fighting for their survival every single day. Madam Chairperson, education and health have been identified in the platform for action as investments in women's future. Education for women is particularly important because of its proven multiplier effect on the development process. Studies and experiences have shown that increasing levels of female education are inversely correlated with high levels of fertility. It has also been proven that female education generally has a positive impact on the nutritional status of the family. These, needless to say, have significant consequences for society as a whole. In most of Africa, Madam Chairperson, the issue therefore is not that these essential services are still not available on an equal basis, but rather that the education and health services are not available at all, or that these services are in decline because in 37 of the world's poorest countries, health and education budgets have been halved. Surely, therefore, Madam Chairperson, one of the challenges of the Fourth World Conference on Women has to be to find ways and means of helping the African women to break out of the vicious cycle of poverty, appalling social conditions, and dependence. This must surely be a separate area of critical concern. Nothing short of the transformation of African economies is required. There has to be a complete reorientation of the whole basis of development in the continent. The World Conference will be attended by hundreds of women and organizations together representing millions of women. These women and men can be agents of positive change by using their powerful lobbying capacity to influence change. Madam Chairperson, it is sobering, if not depressing, to realize that there are still numerous and complex problems remaining to be solved before women can stand anywhere near the men. But our inspiration must and should remain our desire to succeed. I thank you, Madam Chairperson.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Zambia. And I would like now to call on the distinguished delegate from the representative of the World Food Programme.
Thank you. Madam Chair, Madam Secretary General, distinguished delegates and colleagues, on behalf of Mrs. Catherine Bertini, the Executive Director of the World Food Programme, I would like to convey to you and this Commission the programme's continuous commitment to improve conditions of women living in poverty and situations of food insecurity. WFP is the single largest source of grant assistance to developing countries in the UN system involving and benefiting women through targeted supplementary feeding programs, employment and improved economic and social infrastructure resulting from food for work schemes, safety net schemes including assistance in emergency caused by war and drought, food stamps programs and compensatory schemes. We've asked for the floor to highlight our particular concerns of today and commitments for the future, particularly bearing in mind that all WFP-supported projects are executed by national agencies. WFP supports currently some 237 development projects worth $2.8 billion, benefiting approximately 18 million people. The participation of women in these projects differs per sector and per country, but has been estimated to range between 30% and 50%, and in some projects even 90%. On the other hand, relief assistance funded by WFP in 1993 alone reaches 29 million people, of whom 75% are estimated female. For WFP, the major challenge does not lie in increasing the numbers of female participants. Rather, success depends on increasing the lasting economic and social benefits that derive from such participation, be it skills, improved land, employment, education, health and nutrition. WFP is very much aware of the fact that women join WFP-supported projects out of necessity, not necessarily because the design of the programs always takes into account their roles, responsibilities and status in society. This concern has been expressed at policy level by the WFP governing body, the Committee on Food Aid Policies and Programs, and has been translated into WFP Women in Development Policies and Sectoral Guidelines in 1987 and 89, respectively. Our plea to the member states here is to focus in the platform of action on strengthening the mechanisms into the mainstream to incorporate socio-economic and gender concern in development and emergency programming and implementation. Gender issues for WFP are not reduced to a single dimension male-female relationship, but are rather placed in a broader framework of understanding and supporting the socio-economic conditions of women and men from adolescence to adulthood. WFP would like to see the platform of action propose strong mechanisms to ensure the development of gender-specific programs. In order not to perpetuate the direct international assistance to vulnerable groups, we need to address the socio-economic and gender differentials among men and women in, for instance, mobility, meeting labor requirements, illiteracy rates, working experience, access to resources. Gender inequality is also a reality in WFP emergency assistance, as much as it is in development assistance. Emergency programs also would need to address the conditions of women and children, refugees and displaced. They are larger in number and have fewer options than men, notably mobility, alternative resources of livelihood, tradable assets at their disposal and skills. At the same time, we need to acknowledge women's capacities and we call attention to the process of changing roles and responsibilities in society. This is particularly relevant for the rehabilitation programs in order to acknowledge women's traditional and non-traditional contributions made during armed conflicts, droughts and other long-term emergency situations, in coping with all family needs, while being deprived from security, basic health and education facilities. The importance of having socio-economic and gender-specific insight in factors explaining people's conditions have been repeatedly acknowledged at this forum and many others at all levels, including the grassroots movements. Therefore, WFP would like to see the platform of action put more attention on strengthening national capacities to use socio-economic and gender statistics within sectoral ministries and organizations, particularly relating to the variables explaining poverty and food insecurity. WFP committed itself with the Joint Consultative Group on Policy of the UN to support the work of the UN Statistical Department in strengthening such national capacity. Furthermore, we are co-financing the production of the second edition of the World's Women, which this time also will further highlight gender aspects of poverty and food insecurity. The second area of concern relates to mechanisms to promote the dialogue within governments and with donors to attend to the practical as well as strategic needs of women. Food aid as a development resource for women and men to create assets is by definition only effective in combination with technical support. Therefore, WFP welcomes the decision to focus on the development of a platform of action for the future, to stress the importance of collaboration and coordination among various groups, institutions and agencies. Success of WFP-supported projects depends largely on finding appropriate partners that can provide the technical, socio-political, economic and legal inputs required to strengthen women's conditions. In this respect, the joining of forces between sectoral and gender expertise is of vital importance to improve targeting women within mainstream development and emergency programs. Government's requests may not always reflect specifically government policies and strategies to integrate women in socio-economic development. While these policies often do exist, they are not necessarily integrated in the programming by those counterparts negotiating with WFP. With this constraint in mind, we request the Platform of Action to identify stronger and technically appropriate mechanisms to promote this integration. Particularly, we would call for mechanisms to include people's local organizations and intermediate organizations to become part of the negotiations to ensure that donor support is to felt needs. WFP itself is taking advantage of the process of preparation of the Fourth World Conference on Women to create a renewed momentum of gender-specific analysis and targeting of WFP support. We need the Platform of Action to be specific on mechanisms how to get better data and how to integrate those in the dialogue on priority areas for food aid support. Within the organization, such momentum is in fact built up through efforts at national level to document experiences of women participating in food aid projects, particularly on how they address their conditions of poverty and in food insecurity. At present, WFP is undertaking a major review of its policies and system of accountability. One of the objectives is to strengthen its role in advocacy, as well as the concrete support to hungry and poor women in strategic areas outlined in the Platform of Action. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the World Food Programme, and I now call the representative of the Economic Commission for Africa.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, Madam Secretary General of the Fourth World Conference, distinguished delegates and the participants. On behalf of the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, I would like to convey to this 38th session of the Commission on the Status of Women on the activities that have been undertaken by the Economic Commission for Africa in preparation for the regional preparatory meeting to the Fourth World Conference. Madam Chairperson, as you are all aware, ECA is responsible for the preparation of the Fifth Africa Regional Conference on Women in Development, which will be held in Dakar, Senegal, from the 16th to the 23rd November 1994. This is going to be a ministerial conference, starting with a technical meeting, followed by the ministers. Now, the conference will review progress made in the advancement of women in the course of the implementation of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies, would identify what the obstacles for their implementations have been, and come up with concise and action-oriented guidelines which would help to accelerate the implementation of the targets set in the Abuja Declaration on the Participatory Development, the role of women in the 1990s. This was a declaration which was adopted in 1989 at the regional conference which took place in Abuja in Nigeria. Now, as part of the preparation for the Fifth Africa Regional Conference, ECA activities are to monitor, review, and appraise the implementations of the targets, as already said, set in the Abuja Declaration, as well as the recommendations set in the implementation of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies. So far, I would like to highlight some of the activities which have already been undertaken and are being undertaken by ECA in preparation for the regional conference. In March 1993, last year, ECA held and brought together United Nations agencies to coordinate and to look into the activities to be undertaken in preparation for the regional conference. Also, during the regional interagency meeting, an interagency task force was established to coordinate the preparations for the African Regional Conference. Now, an agenda for the regional conference was adopted and was adopted by the ECA Conference of Ministers last year. There are 4 major areas that the conference will focus on, namely women in the peace process, social equity and gender and culture, empowerment of women, including the political, social, and economic empowerment of women in Africa, and finally, women, environment, and sustainable development. So far, for the time being, ECA has undertaken a number of activities to sensitize member states in their preparatory activities. To start with, an information package, including guidelines for the preparation of national reports and other information pertaining to the regional and the World Conference, has been sent to all member states for their preparations. Consultants to assist in the preparation of technical papers for the conference have also been commissioned, and a draft regional platform for action is under process. Last year, in November 1993, ECA participated in a pre-conference of the Conference of the African, Francophone, and Lusophone Ministers of Women Affairs and Rural Development. The main objective of this meeting was to sensitize member states, educate and inform them on the important role played by rural women in Africa, and propose strategies and recommendations for the improvement of their status. The report of this meeting will constitute a background document to the regional conference, as well as an input into the African platform. Again, in the same month, in November 1993, the ECA facilitated and participated in the Regional Conference on Women and Peace, which was held in Kampala, Uganda. The issue of peace at this meeting was the priority theme and was adopted for full consideration at the Regional Conference on Women in Dakar. The conference also adopted an action plan entitled Kampala Action Plan on Women and Peace. Issues from this action plan will also be incorporated into the African Platform for Action. Finally, again in December 1993, ECA organized and convened an expert group meeting to consider strategies for enhancement of women's skills in mainstreaming and also decision-making, and to review progress being made in the preparation for the regional conference preparatory to the World Conference on Women. Strategies and recommendations on the role of the women in the media, on their disseminating information and sensitizing different components of the society on gender issues and increasing public awareness were also adopted. Finally, Madam Chairperson, one of the major preoccupations of the ECA is to ensure that African women's concerns and interests are fully included in the issues to be brought to the World Conference. In this regard, sub-regional workshops are now underway, being undertaken during this month and the next month throughout the African region. Now, these sub-regional workshops are being conducted in the sub-regions, namely East, North, Central, West, and Southern Africa. The main objective of these sub-regional workshops is to sensitize member states, educate and inform them on the objectives of the World Conference, and urge men and women and the youth to actively get involved in the preparation of the national status reports. Again, the preparation of the 5th African Regional Conference preparatory to the 4th World Conference is obviously a long process and requires proper planning and coordination at the national and regional level. ECA will continue to work closely with the member states, the UN agencies, as well as the Organization of African Unity and the NGOs to sustain the successful organization of the regional conference. In this regard, there is a need to keep up the momentum of interest leading up to the World Conference, even beyond, by instituting a vibrant and communication campaign strategy to ensure that the national reports have inputs from all levels of constituents in their respective countries, and that information on the region and world conference is widely disseminated to reach men, women, and youth from all walks of life. Africa must prepare well to sensitize men, women, and children through a process of consensus building, which will help to highlight critical issues around which the region could once again come up with a clear, committed statement, namely the platform for action. I thank you.
I thank the representative from the Economic Commission for Africa. And now I call the representative of the Disabled Peoples International.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, there are more than 500 million disabled people in the world today. It can be assumed that half of them are women with disabilities of all ages. Attitudes and prejudice of the public, including family, community, and even the government, which are stereotyped and negative toward disability, make women with disability face both discrimination that comes with being a woman and being disabled. Furthermore, it is ironic that in addition to the discrimination and prejudices we face from society as a whole, the disabled women also face discrimination from other women once she becomes disabled. And that we must again struggle to include our specific concerns in the platform for action. It is not necessary to reflect women with disability everywhere in the usual litany of areas of specific concern. In most areas, our concerns are in substance the same as those of all women. But there are some important actions that should be considered in the platform for action to be adopted at the Fourth World Conference on Women, specifically to allow women with disability to play their full and equal role with all women in society. Access to education and training for girls and women with disability is one of our strategic objectives. If women with disabilities have this access, they can be prepared to enter any field and make use of their abilities, both physical and mental. The reality is that women and girls with disability are considered less valuable than other women and more costly to educate, and are therefore given less opportunities to education and training. Employment is a critical component in enabling women with disability to achieve self-esteem and social recognition. When special training is needed, women with disabilities should not be disadvantaged in comparison with other women and other population groups. They should have appropriate access to all training programs. It is necessary to take special steps to ensure this access so that the considerable contributions that women with disability can make derived from the experience can be made possible. The same situation occurs with regard to health care. The special needs of women with disability to health care are not as well met as for other girls and women, especially in terms of primary health care in developing countries. Special efforts should be taken to cover these health needs at home and in access to health clinics and hospitals. This will help prevent disabilities from becoming worse and enhance rehabilitation. WHO and other relevant agencies should be encouraged to provide adequate training programs for health personnel regarding the specific needs of women and girls with disability. There should be no discrimination against women with disability in access to health care services. These three actions can provide the basis for women with disabilities to play a full and equal role in the economy, in the family, in politics, and in the community, and guarantee their self-determination on the same basis as other women. Madam Chairperson, I wish to thank the Commission for its decision at its last session in Resolution 37/7 to make the fourth World Conference on Women fully accessible to women with disability. Since I did not notice this in the Secretariat report on preparation for the conference, on behalf of my organization and of women with disability everywhere, I am looking forward to learning about the progress being made to ensure that the conference will provide for the necessary facilities to full participation by women with disability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Disabled Peoples International, and I now call the representative of Habitat International Coalition.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The Habitat International Coalition is the global body of human settlements NGOs. It speaks at the UN on behalf of the poor and the inadequately housed. Its Women and Shelter Network is an integral part of the coalition and is also a global body with centres in about 30 countries in all regions of the world. These initiative centres are NGOs working with women at grassroots level. The network provides a channel for women in poor communities to identify their concerns and priorities, to exchange information and ideas, and to bring these to world attention. Women in poor communities need a voice in international debate and in an international meeting such as this. The HIC Women and Shelter Network would like to see a growing role for grassroots women's groups in United Nations meetings, both official commissions and conferences and in NGO fora. We endorse the opening up of the UN system and would like to see it accelerated. Women in poor communities have many shelter concerns, and these have emerged through our networking process. Their priorities are the survival and sustenance of their families and communities. In the last 2 decades, poor women have suffered inordinately as the prevailing model of economic growth has worsened the living conditions for their families, placing impossible burdens on the women. The devastation of environmental resources has driven rural women to struggle to defend such resources and forced millions more into urbanization. Women in urban poor settlements in the Third World try to provide their families with food and services, but are handicapped by economic policies that cut back on the provision of public services, such as water and fuel, which women are traditionally supposed to provide, and on services such as health and education. The good side of this is that women are finding new leadership roles in popular movements, in Latin America in particular, as they organize to provide such services as food, sanitation and waste disposal, and to combat disease outbreaks such as cholera. But these roles need to be more recognized and more supported, both at the community level and nationally and internationally. Urban poor women are also most affected by forced evictions, when informal urban settlements are moved aside in the name of development, usually by bulldozers. For this reason, the Women and Shelter Network takes an active part in the international campaign against forced evictions and calls on this Commission to recognize the human right to housing and against forced evictions. And I refer here to UN Resolution HSC 14 L15 of 1993. More, we call on this Commission to include in its platform for action the equal rights of women and men to ownership, including inheritance, of land, property and productive assets. And I would stress the inheritance of land, which has many customary blocks, particularly in Africa. Currently, women own and control only a tiny fraction of the world's land and productive resources. In the view of members of HIC Women and Shelter Network, this is a specific constraint on not only women's economic life, but also on the economic life and survival of communities and whole regions of the world. But most fundamental of all, the HIC Women and Shelter Network calls for the whole model of economic development to be reviewed. In this, we support Women's Action Agenda 21 and the intervention of the delegation of Zambia just now in this session. We believe a new form of structural adjustment is required, scrapping the old one, which is only worsening women's lives. The HIC Women and Shelter Network calls on this Commission to include in its platform of action a strategic objective that addresses the international finance institutions. Specifically, the priorities of the new World Trade Organization, which has replaced GATT, must be formulated to give priority to the sustainable protection of the environment and the sustenance of people, and not, as at present, giving overriding priority to economic growth. And this is our most sincere plea to this gathering, that this should be addressed by your platform of action. Finally, we are very pleased that the Women and Shelter Network is recognized in a resolution of the General Assembly coming from the Human Settlements Commission that governments at all levels, including local government, should actively work with our network and similar NGOs throughout the world. And I would call on members of this Commission in particular to take advantage of the resources our network offers at every level in countries where it is active throughout the world. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
I thank the representative of Habitat International Coalition, and I now call on the representative of the Interparliamentary Union.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, on behalf of the Interparliamentary Union, I would like to congratulate you and the other members of the Bureau on your election. I would also like to say that our organization is particularly glad that it's a parliamentarian, Mrs. Mongella, who has been chosen as Secretary General for the conference in Beijing. This is extremely encouraging. The Interparliamentary Union is preparing actively for the Beijing conference. We've undertaken various activities. At the national level, we encourage parliamentarians to participate in the preparatory process and also to try to become members of their delegations to the conference per se. We think it very important that parliamentarians be involved in the work of the national committees to thereby participate in the evaluation and assessment, which is very important before Beijing. At the international level, the Interparliamentary Union has undertaken an ambitious activity. It is preparing a plan of action to remedy current imbalances in the participation of men and women in political life. It is also considering sending to Beijing one delegation which would have equal representation of men and women. We are also organizing in Beijing, along with the National Congress of the People of China at its headquarters, a one-day meeting for parliamentarians attending the conference. This meeting is an invitation of the National Congress of China, and it will bring together all parliamentarians who are in Beijing, whether they be members of their national delegation or in NGO delegations. The meeting will be on 7 September 1995, headed by Madam Chen Ma, Vice Chairman of the National Congress of the People and President of the Federation of Women of China. We hope that Mrs. Mongella will be able to attend the meeting so as to establish a bridge between the actions of governments and the actions of parliaments. We think this is very important, and so we we believe that everything to be done in Beijing should subsequently be translated into action at the national level and at the parliamentarian level. And we thereby believe that parliamentarians should be involved in preparing for and in participating in the Beijing meeting. So, as I say, we are particularly glad that Mrs. Mongella is Secretary General, and we do hope that she will attend the meeting on 7 September. Now I would like to speak a little about our plan of action and explain how and why the Interparliamentarian Union has started establishing a plan of action to remedy current imbalances in the participation of men and women in political life. After Nairobi, we realized that there was an enormous lack of information about political involvement. We noted that despite undeniable progress, 40 years following the adoption of the Convention, parliaments are still dominated by men throughout the world. If you look around today, we have produced a map, and it is available here. The map shows that there is just over 10% of women in parliaments. In 1988, the figure was about 15% and 13% earlier. So there is currently a drop in women's participation in parliaments. And we wanted to react to this. Our idea is the following. Today, there is no consensus on the definition of democracy, but in the Interparliamentary Union, we believe that democracy can be meaningful and real only if political orientations and national legislatures are defined equally by men and women, taking equitably into account the interests of these two parts of the population. I think that this is a meaning of democracy which is particularly relevant to Beijing. The absence of women in political bodies and this idea of equal participation and democracy is one that we have begun to work on. So we were trying to establish a plan of action using this concept of equal participation, parity, so that there is a kind of partnership which will show a real dynamism between men and women so that they can effectively tackle the problems of the communities. And, Madam Chairman, I see that it is mainly women who are present here in the room, and I wonder, in Beijing, as in Nairobi, are we going to see a large number of women, or are we going to see greater parity in the delegations? I would make an appeal here. I think it essential and that it would be fruitful that in Beijing we do not have delegations made up 80% of women, but rather that we try to have more equal participation of men and women. On the plan of action, it has been drafted on the basis of suggestions to remedy this imbalance in political life. It is currently a draft. It will be distributed here tomorrow. The plan of action was based on suggestions and proposals made by various parliaments that are members of the Interparliamentary Union. The draft was prepared by a working group made up equally of men and women, 12 parliamentarians from each region, a man and woman from each region: Bolivia, Bulgaria, Finland, Indonesia, Philippines, Poland, the Syrian Arab Republic, Senegal, Sudan, Uruguay, and Zimbabwe. The plan of action was prepared on the basis of the proposals made, taking into account also the need to find common parameters and sufficiently flexible formulae to deal with problems facing the various regions and countries. And so we have flexible wordings and formulations, but also specific proposals, which are quite specific. We are currently consulting on the plan of action. It has been submitted to our Council in September. It has now been submitted to all the parliaments so that they can respond to it. So we wanted to have a democratic review of the plan so that it can respond to national realities as much as possible. So today, each parliament can send us its comments, and then our working group will be meeting in a few days in Paris to consider all of the ideas and suggested amendments so as to develop a final draft. Just a week ago, we had a meeting in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso of the Pan-African Congress of African Women Parliamentarians, to consider the plan from the viewpoint of Africa and see whether it responds to the needs of the region. I'm very happy to say that the meeting was a very fruitful one. The African men and women attending the conference showed a real interest in the plan of action. They supported it, making a few suggestions here and there. And they made one basic suggestion. There are 4 major sections to the plan. One about political participation, what conditions need to be met to enable women to participate. Then we also took account of civilization, culture, religion, education, employment, participation in economic life. Then section 2 is the legal basis for equality between men and women. What do constitutions provide? What are the mechanisms of the law? And how can one establish a mediator to ensure equality in various countries? Well, this is over the long term, although it does exist in a few countries today. Then we have a section 3, political participation at the national level. Now, this is the very heart of our plan of action, and it deals with making women more politically aware, ensuring respect for equality between men and women in political parties. Then there's the participation of women. Then we have a 4th section, participation by women in activities of the Interparliamentary Union itself. One has to look after things at home first and see how one can manage affairs. So we felt in the Interparliamentary Union that we had to look at how things worked in our own union. The Pan-African Congress of African Women Parliamentarians made one essential suggestion, namely this. They suggested adding a section, follow-up and evaluation mechanism every 5 years to see how the plan of action was being implemented. I think this was lacking in our plan of action, and I think it's very important to have it so that we can check and monitor to see if the proposals are being followed up on. The plan of action will be distributed tomorrow. You can all have a look at it. I trust on behalf of the Interparliamentary Union that the plan, which is our major input at the intellectual level to the Beijing conference, the major input of the parliamentarians involved in politics, as I say, we hope that the plan of action can be integrated in the plan of action, the platform of action, and we trust that it will be food for thought and in-depth consideration. Before concluding, Madam Chairman, I would like to say that the Interparliamentary Union, although it has focused on its priority area, namely politics and parliaments, we trust that it will not neglect the other aspects, equality and development and justice and peace. Then there's also the question of violence against women. The Interparliamentary Union is very anxious that the declaration adopted by the General Assembly a few months ago will be reflected insofar as concerns its principles and its points in the national legislations. It's very important that parliamentarians undertake to consider their national legislation in the light of that declaration, and that they should make sure that the principles in the declaration are reflected in their national legislation. The same would apply to the elderly and the old. Through all of these activities in the Interparliamentary Union, we are trying to ensure that we work fruitfully in making people aware of things. This is a long-term undertaking, but we trust that it will ensure greater and equal participation by men and women in political affairs. In the Interparliamentary Union, we do not really look at women as problems of women as such. They are problems of society. It's not a question of doing things for women, by women, with women. It's rather a way of dealing with how things work in society, and we hope that everybody can work together. This is how the Interparliamentary Union works. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
I thank the representative of the Interparliamentary Union. I'm afraid that ends our list of speakers for this afternoon, and so the meeting will have to adjourn early. Distinguished delegates, tomorrow morning the Commission will have the honor of hearing an address by Her Excellency Mrs. Mary Robinson, President of Ireland. I should therefore like to request delegations to be in their seats promptly at 10 a.m. in order to hear this important statement. Before I adjourn this meeting, may I call the Secretary for some announcements.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. The Secretariat has been asked by United Nations security officials to invite participants whenever possible to take their belongings with them when they leave the room. It seems that our security officers often receive reports of missing property when in fact these things have been left behind. So please be very careful with your personal belongings. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
This meeting is adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.